Thank you, Peter. I'm going to continue right where he left off. One of the intriguing things about the way Dr. Rood taught was he collected newspaper clippings from all over the world. You could get the South China Morning Post or some local paper from a part of the United States that you'd never expect. And he used those to teach. He'd bring a stack of these to class very often, and then you'd start to see the sort of doors open based upon working with just a few details in the clipping like that. So one of the ones he sometimes brought in, I remember this well, was from a publication in London called Strategic Survey. From 1971, 15 March, Mexican government announces discovery of plot for its overthrow by guerrillas of the National Movement for Revolutionary Action, recruited in Moscow and trained in North Korea, 5 Soviet diplomats expelled from Mexico. He might then supplement that with something else he was reading for the local Los Angeles Times, which is close to Claremont, had interesting details like the fact that these guerrillas as Mexican students were also trained in East Germany and then in Moscow at Patrice Lumumba University, which was famous for exporting revolutionaries, and that before coming back to Mexico, they'd gone on to North Korea. He would then sort of ask us to think about that and challenge us with questions about just how it was that that kind of itinerary would be developed and why, and who was it that signed off on all the orders that were required to do such a thing, and took responsibility for all the passports which had to be stamped in all those unusual countries. And gradually we find ourselves as students coming along to thinking about just what it was that the Soviets and their bloc had in mind for Mexico, and then maybe New Mexico, and what it could mean for international relations, what it meant about the security of the U.S. His argument in the end was that Mexico was getting kind of boxed in by Soviet efforts of diverse kinds, and that this kind of opening of guerrilla warfare could be part of the problem. Those go back now, those sort of experiences that guys like me had go back to the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, and at that time there was not much literature on terrorism. So Rood was a great teacher for me because he invented a lot of these things himself. He was a master at understanding political action, especially the violent kind. And he somehow managed to teach us a great deal about terrorism, which was a problem in 1980 and 1982. But it wasn't one in which he had formal academic training. He knew how to use that small sliver of information to get inside a problem and begin to sort of see the problem from the inside with a wedge that was just as small as an obscure clipping. He understood the psychology of power, and he knew that terrorism was all about power and sometimes bloodshed, but that understanding the psychology of it was as important as understanding the politics. At bottom, Rood taught that most international relations is based upon power. He included in that, in his books and articles, things like a definition which would include power as the capacity to inflict physical and psychological pain and then manipulate human relations. With nations, for example, threatening war to conjure up images of death and destruction in order to create those fears and then play upon them to obtain state ends. He was a great practitioner of what we all now call open intelligence, as though this is some great epiphany for us, but that was what all those newspaper reports were about. That's why he would occasionally have the transcript from some obscure transmission out of, say, a Bulgarian state radio having to do with some foreign affairs. Like Osama bin Laden, whose handbook for guerrillas tells us that 80% of what you need to know about your enemy can be found in open sources. Rood was already a practitioner of open source intelligence. And he also tried to keep us focused on states. I say that because much of what I've written about is called sub-state actors, as we call them now. It's a term Rood never used, but he was very adamant that you had to look behind actions by individuals to see if there was a state purpose or a connection to states. And he used to prompt us in that way all the time. So today what I want to do in my sort of maybe the next 35 minutes before I turn to the interesting part, which is your questions and discussion ideas, is to look a little bit back at the problem of state sponsorship of terrorism, bringing together then those individual actors and governments. To think about this first from an aspect of the Soviet bloc, which was a practitioner of the business when I was working with Dr. Rood. A second, to consider a couple of the free agents or semi-free agents that intrigued Dr. Rood, two states. A third would be to look at states which have become so intermixed with this drugs business that they're on the one hand practicing narco-terrorism and on the other making money off it for state purposes. Four, to name briefly the four countries that our government's most concerned about as sponsors of terror. A quick mention of Pakistan as a current problem, and then maybe a couple of generalizations that we consider. So let's go back then to part one, the Soviet bloc. The USSR had a clear and open policy for anyone who wanted to talk about it, of partisanship, as you'll remember, for national liberation movements, so they defined them. They were open about this in all their publications, at the United Nations, in their multilateral relations. They worked through the Warsaw Pact to supply overt, and sometimes covert, military aid of great importance. There were literally tens of thousands of Cuban troops, for example, at one point fighting in Africa to defend or overthrow regimes that the Soviet bloc thought needed attention. They advocated all this, too, with a conviction about ideology. They were a state system that had at its core ideological truths in their opinion, and they were fighting to uphold those. It was a serious fight. They also thought they were doing well, and Dr. Rood used to like to read this kind of thing, which is rather common from whether Khrushchev in January of '61 or Brezhnev in February of '76. They would often talk about the balance of power changing right before our eyes in the world. So this was one part of Soviet strategy for a larger revolutionary policy. The strategy would be worked out by people in the Kremlin, by the International Department of the Communist Party, and they did things, for example, on terrorism, such as a Warsaw Pact meeting in Varna in 1967, because some documents were smuggled out later. There are meetings like that which can be shown to have set up the Soviet strategy, to put it into effect, to export the terrorism in effect. A group like the Palestine Liberation Organization was an absolutely perfect group for the Soviets to work with. And one of the things he always taught us was about the long-term character of foreign policies. And one day he handed me a newspaper called Fatah. It was the name of the guerrilla group that Arafat set up within PLO. Fatah published not only a paper, but of course, think about it, an English language paper to appeal to people outside the obvious circles. And in this paper, there was a photograph, which I've never forgotten. It was labeled on the date somewhat ambiguously, but from the late 50s. This was a publication of the late 70s I was looking at. And this picture showed a couple of boyish old guerrilla types from the Palestine movement. There was a guy named Abu Ammar, according to the newspaper. Well, that was the nom de guerre of Yasser Arafat. There were several other guys who became very famous in the movement later. The picture was taken in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, about 1959. And it was evident from the newspaper that they were proud of the length of their contacts with the Soviet bloc. And so that was a kind of moment for me to see just how serious the Soviets were about this strategy of exporting a revolution. And so later on, you would get, for example, an interview with a Danish newspaper in '79, in which a PLO guerrilla talked about his training behind the Soviet lines. And there was a big story in the New York Times Sunday magazine one year by a fellow named Robert Moss, who was a good writer on intelligence, that described all that too. And so the Soviet bloc was deeply engaged in the kind of export of this kind of militancy, and they did it for state purposes. Rood was very interested in two countries, which I want to mention in passing. And you can see this stuff in his book, Kingdoms of the Blind, 1981, very fine book. He was interested in Yugoslavia and Libya because they were intriguing to him because, on the one hand, they sometimes seemed to serve some Soviet bloc purposes, but they were also clearly independent in certain ways of Moscow, and proud of it, and happy to talk about it. And our diplomats believed them to be pretty independent. So Yugoslavia and Libya. First, Yugoslavia. Belgrade, and of course the country's gone now, but Belgrade as a capital was governed, as was the nation, by something called the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. They were proud of that sort of political ordinance. They had a degree of independence from the USSR, and they were widely known for non-alignment in scholarly circles. But they also had observer status on the Comecon Mutual Economic Assistance Pact, and they did many other things that indicated certain links to Moscow. Another thing about them was their overt commitment to international revolution. They weren't shy about that, and used to talk in great terms about it, and they had the infrastructure. That is, to go back to the Palestinians, and they supported others. The Palestinians had, in effect, an embassy in Belgrade, and used to come to and fro. So the Black September team that did the Munich massacre in '72 actually traveled through Yugoslavia on its way to Munich. And when I was on congressional staff in 1985, there was another famous case involving some Palestinians, the Achille Lauro hijacking. And I was quite intrigued to see that once again some of those people passed through Yugoslavia. I actually wrote a couple of articles about this, which got my boss in Congress denounced on page 1 of Politica, which was the largest daily in Yugoslavia. And I think Rood might have enjoyed that. Libya is a little bit different case. Libya, of course, south thereof, across the Mediterranean, ruled by a very independent-minded guy, Muammar Gaddafi, who got to power in a coup. Gaddafi then began transforming the country in a way that was intriguing, taking massive amounts of Soviet bloc aid and advisors. There were literally several tens of thousands of advisors from the bloc. All the states were working, some on air defense, some on agriculture, some on training tank units, all kinds of things. The Libya case was an interesting one. Muammar Gaddafi's hard to sort of summarize politically, but we could say, if we thought in poli-sci terms, of him as a revisionist power. He was making global revolution, and he was willing to commit the assets that it took. The range of his operations was truly amazing. In 1 year alone, 1984, CIA thinks they've identified some 25 different international terrorist attacks done by opponents of power in Libya. In Europe, to name one area, they were involved with Sardinian separatists, Red Brigades, Basque ETA, French direct action, on and on. Very interesting. There were even some right-wingers in Italy, for example, in the underground, who were taking Libyan money. Well, their favorite group was probably the Palestinians, of which I've spoken. For example, they paid, it would appear, $3 million for that operation in Munich in 1972 by Black September. They were subsidizing other groups like George Habash's Palestine Front for the liberation of Palestine. And we can't forget Abu Nidal, because in those days, the 1980s, probably they were the sort of equivalent of Al-Qaeda. They were the biggest, most important, most lethal actor on the terrorist stage at that time, Sabri al-Banna, or Abu Nidal. Libya was hosting him for years. There were Asian groups that had this largesse as well. And they were active in many other places. I remember State Department once published a whole report about Libyan activities just in Central America, which was amazing to think about. long ways from home. Here in this country, they were hunting down Libyans who dared to be critical of the Gaddafi regime. So, for example, in Denver, in Ogden, in Philadelphia in the early 80s, there were attempted assassinations and one or two successes right here in our country. So the two countries which intrigued Root were sort of attached to the Soviet orbit, but somewhat separable or separate. Yugoslavia, the Orthodox communist state in Southeast Europe, officially non-aligned. Libya, and openly well outside the Soviet bloc, and yet seemingly eager to join in some ways. Let me go on to part 3, and a few little stories about states which have become involved in the narcotics business. We think of this as something which sub-state actors do. So ELN in Colombia is in the business. The Tamil Tigers used to be in the business. FARC in Colombia is famous for it. Some groups don't end up in the dope trade, but some have, and they've made a lot of money from it. Much of this goes back, in one case, to Bulgaria, as part of the Soviet bloc, because they had a meeting in 1967 in which the bloc decided that Bulgaria would create an import-export firm as a way to make distribution of narcotics possible, and a way in which to purchase them and supply them and get back especially weapons normally for their allies. So the Bulgarian Council of Ministers apparently was in on the decision. The Bulgarian state security people, obviously the foreign trade ministry. And they set up an office called Kintex, which later became infamous, an import-export firm, which is a great tool that a state can provide to its agents or its terrorists if it wishes, because it gives so many opportunities, a little thing like that. So this system then begins running guns and running dope out of the Middle East. Usually the narcotics would go north and northwest up into Europe, sometimes as far as Ireland, and then weapons often went south into Turkish hands, groups allied to the Soviet bloc in Turkey, or further south, back down into the Palestine area. A lot of money was made by a lot of people at this, and it was an important thing. More was found out about this when the Pope plot unfolded. You remember May of 1981. The man who shot Pope Paul John II in St. Peter's Square had in his pocket names of Bulgarian diplomats in the embassy there in Rome. And shortly thereafter, the Italians ejected quite a few Europeans and Bulgarians, both based on those charges. The system made enough money so that it was truly having an impact in international relations. And it certainly caught the attention of the Drugs Enforcement Agency. DEA reported in 1984 as follows: in virtually every report available to us since 1970, containing information on trafficking in and through Bulgaria, the state trading organization Kintex is mentioned as a facilitator of transactions, and so on and on. Well, there are other countries that are equally interesting that have become enmeshed in the business, and one that still is today, not a government gone at all like Bulgaria, but still with us, is North Korea. The North Korean, of course, gives rise to a lot of jokes about the Hermit Kingdom and such. When we look close, it turns out they actually have a rather expansive pattern of commercial and other militant sorts of activities. There were many times I used to clip the little newspaper stories in which Bulgarian diplomats or attachés or something might be arrested in foreign capitals for dealing contraband, including hard narcotics. I mentioned this once to a Marine Corps friend of mine. He said, "Oh yeah, I was appointed to be attaché to a Scandinavian country," he named, and the day I got there, they were kicking out some North Korean diplomat because he'd been dealing dope with his official position. The thing that's interesting, though, is that this is not sort of humorous. The Washington Post covered it once, and it was a kind of upbeat and comical story about, isn't this quirky and odd? It really is part of a system. It's part of a system for making money. They need hard currency, and they're willing to do it, and some of that hard currency later gets spent on terrorism matters. It's made this country a very interesting one to watch. They have other commercial activities. For example, they sell a lot of rockets in the Middle East. They help build bunkers for Hezbollah, which were very well hidden and quite sophisticated. They've been linked many, many times to our counterfeit $100 bills. One reason our currency was redesigned at the end of the 90s was counterfeiting. Iran's probably involved. North Korea was definitely involved. And they've moved some of that money around the world by using couriers who sometimes have terrorist backgrounds. So it's a little state, but one causing a lot of problems. They make drugs as well as move them. Their methamphetamine has invaded Japan in a serious way. They're manufacturing heroin. A few years ago, the Australians captured a bunch of guys trying to smuggle it into Australia. There's a fellow named Bruce Bechtel who's done a number of books on this. And in fact, within the party, within the Communist Party of North Korea, there's something called Bureau 39, whose sole function is to do this kind of contraband business out there in the world. It probably is responsible for some 30% of the hard income that North Korea gets from the world. And to talk to another current actor, very important, Taliban. Taliban was an interesting case because it was well known to be making a lot of money from opium sales in its day. And then, of course, the United States ran the group out of the country, and now, of course, they're coming back. You and I are watching sort of Taliban the second time around. From the beginning, they've made a great deal of money in this. There was only a brief period in which they said we aren't going to market narcotics. But in fact, all throughout their career since 1994, this organization has funded itself and made itself strong by narcotics. It's very interesting to watch. So you get early estimates, say, of $80 million a year coming into Taliban coffers. By 2009, the Vienna office of the UN, which specializes in narcotics and crime, was saying, no, it's much more than that. It's probably $100 million a year. They noticed that these drugs were getting into Russia as well as the West, and in fact the report said there are more Russians dying from dope coming out of Afghanistan than ever died in the war with the Mujahideen in the 1980s. Well, by now, there's a very fine journalist, Gretchen Peters, who's done a couple of editions of a book called Seeds of Terror, a play on the words for raising poppies. She says $500 million, with a B, $500 million a year is made by Taliban in narcotics money. So when we wonder about the strength of this organization, or how durable it can be, or whether it can bring down the Karzai government, or whether we ought to be involved in negotiations with it, we have to think about that, and it's the depths of that involvement. Some interesting arguments about how it manages the politics of all this, which we could talk about later. So that's sort of section 3, the illustrations of Bulgaria, North Korea, and Taliban, where literally state-sized actors who are trying to expand their influence and their money with major use of narcotics, sales of narcotics. Part 4 is current affairs, too. What does our government consider to be the main state sponsors of terrorism? It could be these lists get added to and subtracted from. There was a day when Libya was on. There was a day when Iraq was on. Now there's only 4, Cuba, Sudan, Iran, and Syria. Cuba is extremely interesting to study. I have a Senate Judiciary report from the early 80s, which is nearly 300 pages long, and is full of all kinds of evidence about the things that Cuba was doing to further revolution, usually in Central America and Latin America. Cuba has hosted a lot of North Americans, for example. Some of them may be dupes, some of them may be ideological allies. You probably noticed in the local papers there's interest in a fellow named William Potts, who's just come back from Cuba, perhaps to face charges here. He was a hijacker from 1984, and he's been there ever since in Cuba. Another thing that's indicative of Cuba's role is Cuba is now involved in peace talks with respect to FARC. They're being hosted in Havana. They've moved around several other places. But Cuba helped spawn ELN and FARC down in Colombia back in the mid-60s. These groups are now nearly a half-century old. Cuba is no longer aiding them so much, but they provide the locus for peace talks in the hope that Colombia and Cuba, and Colombia rather, and their internal dissidents can work those things out. Cuba was deeply involved in Central American affairs, as I said, and they were deeply involved as with the Isle of Pines, a kind of training zone off the coast, creating a real complex of people, a kind of living network of people who were involved in African affairs as well as combat in African affairs. That's all declined now, quite honestly. I wouldn't be surprised if one day our newspapers told us that the Obama administration is taking Cuba off of the state-sponsored list because their policy seems to have changed in recent years, for reasons you might guess, money and so forth. Sudan. Sudan is the second country on the list today for state sponsors of terrorism. This is really a case of where ideas have consequences, both for the bad guys as well as for the good guys. The ideas are probably in large part those of Hassan al-Turabi. He was a cleric, he still is in Sudan, a very important man. He wanted to turn Sudan into a kind of home base for external revolutions by Sunni, especially Muslims. Hassan al-Turabi developed in kind of the power behind the throne in Sudan. He was the Speaker of the Parliament at one time. He's now under house arrest, or at least he's restricted. But for some long time, he was enjoying himself running a massive international organization by bringing other radicals to Khartoum for conferences, giving them aid and all. And you remember bin Laden spent 5 years in Sudan. There's good reason for that. Bin Laden was run out of Saudi Arabia, but he was welcomed into Sudan in 91 to 96, and it's only from there that he goes on to Afghanistan. Sudan was involved with others in the international movements too. For example, Carlos the Jackal, that famous Venezuelan Carlos the Jackal, is only in Paris now in jail because he was rendered out. It was a rendition by French forces out of Khartoum a number of years ago. Iran. I guess since '79, the revolution's been very important to us in America. It did turn an allied state into what's often been a kind of enemy state, and that's one of those things that happens in politics. For this subject, I think what's key is that Iran may be the single leading proponent of and donor to certain religious kinds of terror groups around the world. Hezbollah, the so-called Party of God, has grown from great weakness to great strength, due entirely to Iranian beneficence. They have the people, they have the will, but they don't have the money, and Iran supplies that. And estimates have risen a great deal, but what's clear is that there are many hundreds of millions of dollars have gone from Tehran's coffers into those of Hezbollah. In practical terms, we in America have seen the sting of this a number of times, the nexus between Hezbollah, other groups like Palestine Islamic Jihad, and Iran, to name a group. So, for example, there was an important murder up in the state of Maryland years ago by a guy named David Belfield, who quickly turned up in Tehran, where he lives quite openly. He's even made a film in Iran. So there's no question about where and who he is. In Tampa, at the University of South Florida, there was a fellow named Sami Amin al-Aryan who was there teaching at an institute in which he talked about relations with the Arab world and the increasing understanding and such. But in fact, he was actually serving as chief of finance for Palestine Islamic Jihad. Also, one of his colleagues, Ramdan Abdullah Shalah, was in the same kind of academic pursuit. But when there was a change for the Palestine Islamic Jihad, at one point when Israel killed its leader, this man turned up in Damascus to assume command of PIJ, the terrorist group. So Iran has been busy. In fact, 2 years ago, there was a plot that was elaborated by the Quds Force to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, which was eventually exposed. So if we see from U.S. News today, or today's paper, Hezbollah is expanding its reach in the Middle East, especially moving into Syria, for example. That's not surprising. The only thing surprising is that actually the guy who wrote the story didn't see that for a very long time, Iran has been central to that. The journalist depicts this as some kind of strengthening relationship. That relationship between Tehran and Hezbollah has always been fundamental to the latter's existence from the beginning. So Syria's involved now getting some defense from Hezbollah gunmen. That's interesting, since the Syrian regime isn't Shia. That's interesting. Syria's got a history too, and things like working with the Kurdistan Workers' Party for very long years, was training the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. And there's a long story about that in Syrian affairs, and Syria's relations with Iran have been close in helping the terrorists. I don't have time to do too much on Pakistan, the next segment, but I do want to comment and say I spent part of my morning reading a report on Mumbai from November 2008. That was not the first time Pakistan supported terrorists, went into India and shot up India or shot up Mumbai, but it was the worst. 60-hour siege, live international television, hundreds of people injured and killed. It's one example of where Pakistan has caused itself a problem by exporting those who commit this kind of international terrorism. So these folks came from a port in Pakistan. They were in constant communication with authorities inside Pakistan on the phone while they were in India doing what they did. The effects of it all, and that's sort of the worst case of some of there are many other training camps in Pakistan, and there are many other instances of their involvement in Indian affairs, in Kashmir and so forth. That case is the most dramatic and one of the most recent. It also throws a light on something Dr. Rood would have wanted us to think about, which is what happens when this kind of aggression occurs. What really has been the effect in India? How much has India done to defend itself in the future? Quite a few things. What has India done by way of retaliation against Pakistan? Almost nothing, so far as I can see. And well, of course, it's a nuclear power. They're both nuclear powers, and therefore discussing retaliation itself is difficult. But I do find it interesting that India's response has been so muted. And I think the teaching of Dr. Rood in the case of the democracies was always that he who provokes and is the aggressor may not necessarily get a feisty response back. It often accomplishes a kind of submission. You often get nothing. And it's a bit like some of the classic appeasement studies of the 1930s, that despite a really horrific case like this, which was so obviously, so heavily linked to authorities in the Secret Service of Pakistan, remarkably little has been done. And nor has the United States done much about that in particular. Pakistan's is sort of trying to ride the tiger, to use the old story, and hope that he never falls off, and hope that he's not eaten by the tiger. And that's a thing governments do sometimes in pursuit of their interests. And India, the enemy from Pakistan's point of view, has done the same thing with the Tamil Tigers. From the mid-1970s, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam had support from the state of India and its province of Tamil Nadu. Powerful support for several kinds of reasons. It ended up rebounding against them. The tiger did eat them, so there was damage to Pakistani, to Indian interests, and there was killings of top Indian politicians by Tamils in those movements. and it was deemed in the end a mistake. And I think that Pakistan will have to come to a conclusion about that too, because they've gone through some of the same track downward. A couple conclusions then. Whether he's right or not, what Dr. Rood used to tell us was that there really isn't a kind of complete peacetime. There's not that kind of important and definable and complete pause between wars that we often like to think of. In his classes, he never talked much about there being sort of post-war periods. He kind of talked about when the next war in that region might come. It's true, I think, too, that for terrorists, when we think about them linked to states, we have to think about whether they are linked in their purposes and actions to that kind of pre-war state, which we would be focused on if we were into. So here's an example. If we ask ourselves, if some of the West European terrorists of the 1980s, for example, were trying to serve Soviet purposes, what would they do in a pre-war status? What would they do that would help the Soviets if they decided to go to war, be stronger, be more fierce, be better prepared? And the answers could include things like doing reconnaissance throughout Europe, which they were doing, killing scientists engaged in developing Star Wars, which was supposed to help do missile defense in Europe against the Soviet SS-20s and such, blowing up NATO fuel dumps, trying to murder the commander of NATO, which they nearly did with rocket-propelled grenades on his armored car. In effect, they were doing things which suited their purposes, but also would have been grand for the Soviets had war occurred, or had the Soviets wished to start war at that point. So there's an important way in which some of these actors are linked in state purposes and can be a useful adjunct in war or pre-war. Both parties in this get something. That is to say, we shouldn't think that just because one group is small and doesn't have state authorities, that it's necessarily hurting in the circumstance, or that it's been forced in any way into the circumstance. Rood never taught that these kinds of sub-state groups were pawns. They don't think of themselves pawns. If they were thinking of themselves in that way, they'd probably be less effective, less confident, and that the system didn't require them to be pawns. So, for example, if we advance to today's news, Iran can dump millions into something like Hezbollah. Both parties think they're getting a great deal out of the arrangement. And you needn't wonder entirely all the time, as we did, about control or submission of one to the other. So some of those early evidence I began with on Bulgaria and such led to discussions in the United States, even in intelligence circles, even within the CIA, to whether or not the Soviets actually controlled those terrorists that were active in Western Europe. And that was kind of a false argument, because they never needed to control them. It was important enough that they understood each other and took prompts in that way and were effective in doing what the other might want, I think. And so you don't see either in modern cases, you don't necessarily see complete control exercised in the way that was in the Lashkar-e-Taiba Pakistan case of November 2008 in Mumbai. Well, they were literally calling in for marching orders about who to kill next and why and what to do. That's not necessary in a lot of these relationships. And I doubt very much that many of the West Europeans were ever completely controlled by any outside power. They do get a good deal. They probably compromise themselves to a degree in terms of their own independence, and it's probably a subject of considerable discussion and argument at times about whether they want a state link. But I think in the end they've decided, many of them, that they get more by way of clandestine document support and easy passage in and across borders and training opportunities in states. I think they tend to think they, by and large, getting a better deal by linking up with the state. The last point would be this, is whether this all sort of works for them. It doesn't always. Terrorism doesn't always work. But I would caution you against some of the opinion that suggests that terrorism doesn't work at all. A couple of reasons. Walter LaCour, a great scholar in terrorism, usually argues that terrorism usually fails. There's a very bad book that came out after 9/11 which says flatly, terrorism always fails and always will. I think one of the key things to see is that it often does work. I do think Pakistan behavior, for example, has weakened India and forced it into the defensive position. But the other part of it is we have to pay attention to what the terrorists are doing and what they're saying. And it's quite obvious from watching their activities that they think they're succeeding. They may not think they're going to win tomorrow, but they think this is a viable tactic or strategy, and they keep doing it for that reason. The gunmen just don't agree with the academics that I mentioned. Rude liked to say that politics is not a soft art because important things transpire in politics. In politics, if it's possible and fruitful, it's likely to be tried. And I think terrorists confront us not just with their brutality, but with their plans and with their strategic objectives. And they demand of us a good deal of study, a good deal of kind of prudential judgment, decisions about what kinds of things we need to do, and a kind of willpower, too, a kind of willpower in our polity to be willing to stand up to them and to oppose that which they do. I'm going to stop right there. Turn it over to you.
Will you take some questions?
Yeah. We have lots of time for questions.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just wanted to ask, you spoke of Yugoslavia, and my dad was born in Bosnia, so I mean he's gone back there a couple of years ago, and I remember how he told us about how many minarets went up in Sarajevo just over the past few years. Can you speak on how state sponsorship of terrorism is sort of rising in Europe? Do you think at all? And if it's actually a credible force similar to the next 20 to 30 years?
I think what we're seeing is the strong influences of Islam introduced into the area, specifically guided by a couple of governments that have spent a lot of time and money thinking about how influence should be managed. One of them, though, is Turkey on the NATO partnership side. Others are like Saudi Arabia, for example, spending a great deal of money there, and Iran. Those three countries are probably the leaders in terms of kind of export ideology. I think that what I would have to be careful about with your question is any suggestion that that translates into terrorism. Because I think within the Muslim community, you name your country, Jordan or the United States, where we have 6 or 7 million, I guess, the kinds who are engaged in terrorism are a tiny minority. And they're often quite at odds with their fellows. So, for example, I read Inspire magazine, which you might look at once or twice as well. The Al-Qaeda publication out of Yemen. They are continually inciting the kinds of things we just saw in Boston, right? But they also are interesting to look at in terms of wider patterns in Islamic thought. And for example, one of the editions carried a very long debate, quite sophisticated, about interpretations of Islam. And these guys in Al-Qaeda were furious that in 2010, a bunch of clerics from all over the world within Islam met in a place called Mardan, Turkey. They met for a couple days. They produced a bunch of documents which thoroughly denounced terrorism. They were quite explicit about that, very strong. Said this is not in the Quran, these people don't represent us, and so forth. And, you and I would never get it. I mean, it would never occur, apparently, to our newspapers or press to even cover the publication of the Mardan Declaration. So I suppose that year we were both grumbling that the good Muslims aren't doing enough, and they're not, sure. But there's an example of a tremendous document, brief, quotable, strong stuff, and it disappears. I mean, it gets no press. But not from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda recognized an ideological challenge and was deeply worried about it. And Anwar al-Awlaki himself, the American citizen later killed, does this long, elaborate denunciation of the document and attempt to refute it. And that's how a guy like me learns about the Mardan Declaration. So there's some of these things that are out there that could be used for purposes of sanity and comity among the religions and all, which we're missing. And so while lots of money is pouring in and building lots of mosques, there is that big difference between the most extreme guys. And another reason to be just a bit cautious on that, there's a great study of self-radicalization that's out in the West. It's called Radicalization in the West, published by the New York City Police Department. It's on the web, you can bring it up, it's like 80 pages. It's a brilliant little thing done about 5-6 years ago. And it notices that as these kind of self-radicalized guys are studied, they often in latter stages become very frustrated with their own mosques and their own imams. They think they're weak and pacifist and not willing to fight and not willing to live and die by the word. And they feel a bit marginalized and very often well before they commit their terror acts, they basically disassociate themselves from the mosque. They might go overseas and go to a camp, or they might just kind of withdraw and then have a surprise like the Sanaya brothers do in Boston for us. But they aren't linked closely to a mosque pushing this stuff. Now some mosques are, and the Londoners have shut some down. The French have a new program that actually requires imams to go through a state training course. You know, France is a very state-driven society. They've got no problem with this, you know. And they make these guys go through a course and they try to screen out the really nutty kinds and the guys who are going to be proponents of terrorism. So there's a difference in France, you know, in that kind of world between the typical imam and the way some of these guys like Al-Qaeda. Yes, what else? What else interests you? Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. You had mentioned that the government of Cuba was hosting a peace talks between the Colombian government and I think you said FARC. Could the Cubans be doing that in an attempt to make it so that FARC has a better moderator that would help them more, so that Colombia might join, like be more open to more radical ideologies, so they can help maybe become another like state sponsor of terrorism in that way that Cuba would become?
You mean strengthen FARC within Colombia and then get a kind of allied state next door? That's a very sensible question. Sure, I'll bet you they'd love to see that happen. Yeah. The FARC also has, because they have a half-century history and they have a strong ideological base, FARC is the kind of entity to think about that too. They used to hope to take control of Colombia, quite simply. But in present times, they've done so badly that they're probably not making concrete plans, at least not now. They probably see this as a kind of a backwater period where they've got to rebuild. A couple of their top leaders have been killed. One or two died just because of age, but a number have been killed by Colombian armed forces. A lot of defections have occurred. They haven't had a kind of resurgence ideologically of people who hold to Castro's views. And the Cubans, for their part, don't seem to be doing that kind of inflammatory thing and that kind of covert aid that was so prominent before. It was prominent before. As against, for example, in some of our Puerto Rican communities felt very strongly this kind of presence, the Cuban sense for what to do next, and a link between groups like FALN and Los Macheteros to Cuba. But right now, the Cubans are just not seemingly engaged in that kind of work. And I think, I mean, I don't want to be dreamy about this, but I'm hopeful that there's going to be enough Cubans who, after Fidel and Raul die, will craft a different kind of government on the island and probably do even less with groups like FARC. But yes, I think you've identified the problem. Sometimes it just seems impossible, doesn't it? You take a country, a great example, Nepal, completely obscure. For many years, politics was affected, war was occurring because of a group of Maoists. You know, not exactly indigenous to Nepal, but they took the Mao model. They wanted to revolutionize Nepal. They managed over time to exert enough strains in the society, and then the monarchy collapsed as well, and mass kind of palace coup. And you get out of nowhere, really, but quietly from the backwaters and the jungles and the outlying areas, you get an increasingly stronger presence of Maoist guerrillas. Very good leaders. One guy had a PhD from India. The other guy is very articulate. They've both been prime ministers since. So after 10 years, 96 to 06, you get a transformation in Nepal, and you get a country which is where now the parliament is dominated by Maoists of all things. The last thing anyone would have expected 10 years ago. So when New York recently received the top executive from the government in Nepal, he got out of a limo somewhere in New York and went to official functions a couple of months back. You're looking at a guy who's a pro-China, pro-Mao, Nepalese communist. Similarly, in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, which starts as so small and uses terrorism and other methods too, gains such power that the Hezbollah now is the dominating presence within the Lebanese parliament. They've effectively compromised Lebanese sovereignty, but they're also helping guide the government every day in Lebanon. So there are degrees of this authority. So I guess, what I would say is, FARC's had a rough last couple of years. Membership's way down from maybe 18 to 20,000, all the way down to maybe 12. But don't count them out. Not when they're making hundreds of millions a year on cocaine, and not when they have all those people in their allegiance, and not when they have such experience. So I would say if you were a Cuban running these peace talks, you would think of FARC as a serious player within Colombian politics. And even if they can't accomplish the revolution, they may still be there for you as an ally in the way that Chavez was in Venezuela. Yes, sir.
What is the United States doing to counteract these terrorist organizations throughout the world? Do you support it, or do you think we should approach these political problems differently?
The U.S. has, although we don't often refer to it as such, the U.S. does have a kind of grand strategy against terrorism. There are continuous efforts in diplomacy, and I don't dismiss those because, for example, if you wanted to go down to Europe and work terrorism problems, all you'd hear about is leaks. And so your first problem would be diplomatic. And you would rely upon the expertise of guys who know how to do those things to calm some concerns in Europe and to open some new avenues for you before you could ever get to the security questions you care most about. When you have somebody like Angela Merkel turning on you, they were formerly a good partner in counterterrorism, you got a problem. So diplomacy is important, and the diplomats also have to work the multilateral organizations. So, for example, I won't go very far with this, but the United Nations actually has made a few steps in recent years. There's a new treaty or two. There's a practical definition for a terrorist act. There's a ban on terrorist financing, which is new. And you've even seen a little aggressiveness out of them here in the Congo, dealing with M23 in the last couple of days. So your diplomats have to work those kinds of connections. You got the economic tool of power, which is actually quite good. We had a national debate about this, didn't we, in 03 and 04, 02, dealing with Iraq. Can sanctions work? How long will it take? People like Colin Powell thought it should take a little longer. George Bush decided to go into Iraq anyway, sooner rather than later. But economic sanctions, I think, have worked in a couple cases. I think they helped bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa, right? I think that they helped a lot to deal with Sudan, which we talked about. When Sudan kicks bin Laden out, and they do, and they keep a lot of his money when he goes, in '96, it's in part because of international pressure. U.S. engendered pressure, which the international community kind of picked up. Then there was a plot against Mubarak in Egypt, so the Egyptians are on board, in fact, before us. And so you got sanctions, which Sudan resented, and they hurt. So Taliban later would ignore those sanctions. They could care less. They were happy to have bin Laden in Afghanistan. But the Sudanese didn't feel that way. Libya also responds to both political and economic sanctions. They're trying to talk about getting rid of the chemical weapons of Syria right now. We did this in Libya. The US and the British, working intelligence and diplomacy, got Gaddafi to basically yield up his equipment for creating weapons of mass destruction. They went onto a ship and they came to the United States. It was an amazing thing that resulted from. And that's intelligence, and that's also diplomacy. So we have all those kinds of things which we do in addition to the drone strikes, which everybody focuses on these days. Those strikes are fascinating for the current president. You know, comes in with the Nobel Peace Prize, but now gets hit from time to time by the center and certainly his left for being too aggressive against terrorists. He's in an ambivalent position. I think he'd like to see, and basically said at National Defense University in May, he'd like to see the winding down of this war on terrorism. He's unenthused about continuing it, which I think is a mistake when we've still got Ayman al-Zawahiri out there. We've still got a lot of guys we need to catch and put under wraps. Probably a mistake, but there's a kind of ambivalence in the current administration as opposed to that which Mr. Bush had for a couple of years. All these tools of power are supposed to be controlled by the National Security Council and by the White House. So what the president thinks is important and what your top advisors think are very important. So people like Quantico and the head of CIA now, John Brennan, and a lot of these other folks really become very important as to what the U.S. will do. Congress a little bit less active. In past years, sometimes I saw more activity on terrorism out of Congress. I'm not seeing too much now. It seems to be mostly executive branch driven, and the NSC is supposed to be the coordinator of all those difficulties. And they are. You know, when you might be a great spokesman for, let's say, new sanctions on Cuba. You know, this is our chance to make Raul step aside and get a new government in Cuba. But you'll get other people who'll say that's not the way to use economic tools. We should keep penetrating Cuba. We should use the power of free market economics to the extent we can to break down the system. By the way, sanctions irritate our allies, and they get undermined when some of the Europeans give money to Cuba or things like that. So somebody has to, in the central branch, sort of sort out all these arguments and decide what to do. The Commerce Department's never going to be for new sanctions on just about anybody. But other national security agencies and divisions of our government will. So those get debated a lot. And it's never very easy shaping policy on these issues. Well, a major in the Army told me something years ago, I remember, that he said the problem is, we were doing a course on this stuff. So the problem is that all your counterterrorism ideas and always have to compete with other parts of U.S. foreign policy, which is true. This era we're in now is unusual. There's not another one like this in our history. Really, you have to go back to the Barbary Pirates or something to see a government like ours focused this explicitly on an overseas terrorist issue for years at a time. And it's quite remarkable to see. And it proves that we have a little bit more stamina than some said. You know, years ago, everybody was always quoting George Marshall saying the democracies can't fight a 7-year war. But in some ways, the White House on this narrow issue of terrorism has pursued al-Qaeda for much longer than that now. Yes?
Thank you for coming. We were speaking earlier about how the Soviet bloc was giving a ton of aid to Palestine. Why would the Soviet bloc be so interested in the Palestinians' fight against Israel and just their fight for liberation in general?
Yeah, it's a good question because the USSR was one of the first states to support the creation of Israel. You know, you read political propaganda now and you might imagine that the state sort of fell out of the skies or was created by the Trilateral Commission of the United States government, the Jewish lobby in Congress or something. The Soviet Union was right on board. They wanted Israel founded. I think it kind of goes back to the gentleman's concern about FARC and its powers within Colombia. I think they saw a prospect for pushing on the closest U.S. ally in the Middle East I think they saw a chance to attack a democracy, Israel, which is very rare for a state in the Middle East to be democratic. Israel always has been. And I think they saw a nascent, budding prospect for revolution, transformation of the state system, and another way for them to exert their own influence. And so that's why they would bring all those guys to the Soviet bloc for years and give them training and tea parties and chances to study and everything else. Patrice Lumumba University was a very important place. Carlos was there. A lot of other guys were there. And they were serious about it, trying to transform the world. It's worth thinking about in our day because when we think about, we're told that what's the policy objective for these Sunni and Shia extremists? It's a caliphate. It sounds so crazy in a way. How could they ever do that? There was a caliphate about the time my father was born. There was, and there still was. And these guys have a long sense of history. And the fact that it's hard doesn't necessarily deter them because they're almost by definition fanatics. And so they're fighting for something which is truly revolutionary, a transnational state, a new state based on any number of current territories and groupings, all within the Ummah, the Muslim community. And that's their vision. And like the Soviet vision, it may not work out, but they're fighting for it. Take it seriously. That's a good question. Yes?
Mine's a little bit more opinion-based, I guess. It was announced today that Japan's foreign minister is actually going to be meeting with Iran's foreign minister about nuclear weaponry and stuff like that. I was wondering if you could just comment on that and what this meeting will mean for other countries if they want to talk to Iran about those kind of issues.
Well, focusing on Iran, if I may, more than Japan, a good example of why my discussion of state sponsorship of terrorism, has its limits. There's a lot of other security issues, and I could see, as I've suggested, that if you're an undersecretary of state sent to Pakistan, you might prefer to talk to them about nuclear issues than Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorism, because you might think it's more important. So that issue is massive, it's important. There's a big debate going on in all security circles about how far they are away from weaponization and what they can do. They have expanded their process of uranium enrichment dramatically. They have something like, I think it's 18,000 centrifuges now, and they're smart enough to disperse them in multiple sites. Some of them are underground, which would make it very hard to take them out. Also, remember, even if you could take out a couple and the others survived, that's its own kind of problem. They are enriching to a higher level than before. They used to enrich to perhaps 5%, now they're enriching to about 20%. They are only a little bit short of where they need to be in a line at least identified by the Israelis. I think it's forgive me, I think it's like 150 kilograms that they have to have of highly enriched uranium, and they're sort of 80 or 90% there. So every state is watching them. The arguments, however, are a little different than they would have been just months ago, right? Because when Ahmadinejad was president, he linked his policy continuously with what I could only call, as an American, hate speech. He'd go to the border of Israel and shake his fist and scream epithets. I mean, that was a little strange. He did a lot of violent and strange things. We have a government now which has given birth to a different president, Rouhani, but he comes out of the system. He actually is an expert negotiator on nuclear issues. He knows the technical side of that cold. He has worked at this sort of NSC equivalent level within the government of Iran for a long time. He's very expert at how the bureaucracy works. He's probably very close with a lot of the Revolutionary Guard people, as well as the typical bureaucracies in foreign affairs. So he's in a position. Outsiders see him as a man who knows things, who knows a lot, and is in a great position to make a deal if he wants one. And I think people like the Japanese and the Washingtonians are sort of studying him to see if he really wants a deal or if he's going to try to create something that's of temporary advantage while they finish their enrichment process. I can't speak to Japan's policy, but Iran has, like Syria or before Iraq, pursued a policy of owning weapons of mass destruction. The fact that we didn't find certain things in Iraq shouldn't change the picture here. Some states are in a drive for that. For years, the Bin Laden organization overtly said that they not only wanted a nuclear weapon, they had a duty to acquire one. And so any state like Iran, which can produce this much uranium in protected zones, has to be watched in terms of both its use of power, missiles, bombs, whatever, but also the prospect of handing off some of that too. Any state which is making this and which is strongly antithetical to us could make a small gift of partially enriched uranium for making what we call a dirty bomb, which just combines conventional explosives with this kind of material. It doesn't kill people, but it creates an utter black zone in any city. It would be a black zone for a half century, and it would be devastating economically as a tool in a city or in a port. And so that's one of the aspects of linkage that Iran will always carry. The problem of discussing Iran will always carry that problem as well. We're getting a lot of pleasant signs out of the new president, as though he truly wants to change relations. But remember that this is a country that's thousands of years old and that has very hard foreign policy objectives, and which since 1979 has been one of the most dedicated enemies of democracy that I've ever studied. They're relentless. And they think they're winning too. They think they're winning. So, it's harder to make a deal with an organization that thinks it's doing well. And I know they're having a lot of economic problems, but hey, so are we. So they're a very deadly enemy, and I would proceed very cautiously. I would at least talk to them, though. If you get me up to the issue of Taliban, I don't think I'd want any part of American negotiations with Taliban. It would be a very bad idea. The Afghans may, but we shouldn't. I expect these talks to continue for some time as each side examines the other. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about Pakistan and United States relations? How do and should we deal with a state that seems to harbor terrorists, but also is a state that we want to have on our side, and we want to have a stable and independent Afghanistan?
The Pakistanis are not in any respect just a state sponsor of terrorism, and so I'm glad you've asked. We not only were closely allied with them in the campaign to drive the Soviet army out of Afghanistan in the 80s. We have many common interests. Our diplomats get along fine. Our military communities are pretty closely linked in many ways. They go to places like Quantico. Last time I lectured in Quantico, I had a question from the Pakistani officer who was obviously concerned about whether Americans were getting pretty angry after the discovery of bin Laden in Pakistan. They have done great work for us in many ways against Al-Qaeda. So you may have noticed that when I talked about them, I talked about Taliban and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and there's a lot of other groups. But as to Al-Qaeda, they have hunted down or marginalized or arrested or killed many, many Al-Qaeda people. And they've cost themselves a lot of lives in trying to do this in places like the Waziristan, north and south. So they get credit for all that, and they want credit for it, and they say that pretty loudly, and they're right. But what they can't do is defend their behavior with respect to Taliban. Taliban is born in 94 out of a kind of seminary complex. They were aided by ISI from the beginning and still are. And they've been relentless against our interests in that way. So the head of CIA met with the head of Taliban's intelligence about 2 days before 9/11, back in 01. And he said, look, we get along on lots of things, but we can't get along with Al-Qaeda. You have got to expel that guy and his buddies from Afghanistan. And you can help with that, but also Taliban's got a big network in your country and we need help. And he was absolutely unwilling to deal with the U.S. demands right before 9/11. So there are both problems and good prospects, you know. I don't think anybody's going to war soon. Not with us, not with India. You know, Pakistan's more sensible than that. But it's a society with unbelievable stresses. There's a continuous revolution in Balochistan that never stops. There's the state malfeasance I've described, a broad program of aiding terrorists and insurgents over the Kashmir issue. They've had turmoil at home, the murder of people like Bhutto and other things which point to internal security concerns. They've had a coup, it was in '99, and some messy elections and corruption charges, so they have a lot to work on. I expect they'll remain a partner and a difficult partner, and we'll keep fighting with them, and keep pressing them, and they us. And so, Churchill always used to hear about how hard it was to fight with allies, but he remarked once that it's much better than fighting without them. And so that we share some strong interests. But this is a state which has gone way too far. We disagree with many things they do, and that they've gone way too far on the issue of promotion of terrorism. And under, let's say, a Republican regime, there would be probably, here, there would be serious debate about adding them to that short list of 4 belligerents involved in state-sponsored terrorism. Maybe about one more question, Peter?
One more question is perfect.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Is there an end in sight? Do you think we'll ever be able to stamp out violent extremism and terrorism, especially when our efforts to do so just usually end up creating more?
The first part of your question, I think the answer is no. I would have to set myself apart from the second part. I don't think that mostly what we've done has created more. I'm sure there's some cases where we could point to that, but by and large, I think that's not true. So I want to argue that. When you're dealing with something like a drone strike, you have to compare the prospects of no action in which a known mass murderer continues to operate against you and you do nothing, or compare it with, say, a snatch effort by special forces, which invariably is going to be bloodier for locals, and maybe our guys too. And in fact, and you can't even now, going back to my reference to the UN, you can't even justify inaction anymore under UN law. Since Security Council resolutions like that came about right after 9/11, all states have a duty. All states have a duty to thrust terrorists outside or deal with them to prevent them raising money and all that. It's an issue UN didn't used to get involved in. They're involved now. So I think it's the more general response is since about 1968 or so, this stuff has been a central part of international politics. There are precedents before, and I don't expect it to go away. And I think what we do is resist it in a way that, say, a big city mayor tries to deal with crime. You never say it's going to be gone. You never promise to eliminate it because you can't. There's too many reasons why it happens, why it works, and so what you do is try to keep it to a minimum. The last administration had a turn of phrase or two, sort of what the policy objective should be, which is basically to get terrorism controlled enough such that it was no longer a source of daily pressing on life, around the globe, but especially for American citizens. That it wasn't a cause of daily fear for Americans, and that would suffice as a kind of end state. No, there isn't an end state for terrorism generally, but there are a lot of groups that pass away. So if you hunt my name down on the web, you can find a lot of material on how terrorist groups end, but that's individual terrorist groups. And they're often, in fact, defeated by the kinds of things we were talking about earlier, a kind of combination of sanctions and pressures and sometimes military force. And there's a lot of groups that have died away or been defeated. And there are many democracies in which to study that. Canada dealing with the Quebec Law, Turkey and Italy prevailing over tremendous internal challenges. The Irish for working out the problem, the British and Irish for working out Northern Ireland. In many respects, what's left is very minor compared to the old damage. So many groups do in fact give up or get defeated. But it takes some strength in government and some determination too. And I hope we keep that as a polity. Can I say before I close that I'm very grateful to Peter. You know, when I was a grad student back in Claremont, I was sitting like where you're sitting and in need of mentorship on a lot of things, just like maybe one or two of you are. The first time I ever got a chance to write something for a publication, it was Peter that arranged it. Paid $50 too, which for a graduate student goes a long way too. The first time I did a lecture tour on Central American wars we were all interested in after my PhD, he helped arrange it. The first book I ever did, which was in fact celebrating Dr. Harold Rood, Ashbrook Center had a key part in typesetting and doing a lot of the rest. So you're not the only ones who are getting good mentoring from Dr. Schramm, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
You should have brought me a beer for that. I did want to say, just as in passing, you bring up Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. The only, can you hear me okay? The only experience I ever had with Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow was in Munich. I was walking down the street. I've been in Munich for about 7 months, and I was very homesick. This is 1968, and I hadn't talked to an American in a long time. Talking to an American, and indeed to speak English for a change. And so I spotted 3 black guys walking down the street in Munich, and I ran after them, thinking naturally they'd be Americans, right? They were speaking fluent Hungarian. I mean, no, fluent Hungarian, Shakespearean Hungarian, beautiful. And so I fell back and walked behind them and listened to them talk Hungarian. They were from Ghana. They were trained at Patrice Lumumba University to be communists and so forth in law. And then they, in political science. And then they were sent to Budapest to study Hungarian and then law in Budapest, which of course was a communist regime as well. Anyway, the short of it is I got to know those guys, and later they became very interesting officials and so on. But isn't that something, you know, how the world can be very organized by certain people with certain ideas and capacities and some support. So the big mistake I made in stopping those guys is, of course, I didn't watch the way they walked. See, because Americans walk differently than all other people around the world, certainly Africans included. So a black American walks like an American, not like a Canadian or a Nigerian, and I didn't know that. I know that now. Americans walk as if they mean it. A man from Ghana, educated or not, he walks as if the world is about to fall in on him, and he's leery. He's a little concerned, a little worried that the local gods will smite him. And he walks accordingly, a little tiptoe, a little leery, you know, lion-like, tiger-like. An American doesn't do that. He just walks like a bull, because he knows who controls fate. It's he himself. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.